Hello. Hello.
Yes.
कर देगा पीछे
Anumeha, can we start now? Anumeha.
It's 5 o'clock.
I think just give 1 minute.
Sure.
You can start. Yeah.
Anumeha, can we start now?
Start.
I did not speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's start. Yeah. Am
Okay.
I? Yeah. I think just give 1 minute. We can start. I think there is some lag in the audio.
Yes. I'll request others to switch off their audio, switch off their camera for now.
Yeah. Let's start.
I think the lag was because we were live streaming on YouTube and and I had not muted that.
Okay.
Huh. So are we ready?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Today we have a very dear friend of mine, Anumeha Mishra, taking your session. Anumeha is my batchmate as well as a very good dear friend of mine. She was among the topper in law school and she has done her master's from Lucknow University. She's pursuing her doctorate from ILI and she is currently assistant professor at the Campus Law Center, Delhi. She has previously taught in at uh, Amity, if I'm not mistaken, Amity
Yes.
University. She is, apart from being a brilliant academician, she's a brilliant singer. I had to add that. And I will, I mean, over to you, Anumeha. Let's begin
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So today we are discussing a topic that is something that I found extremely interesting, especially if we analyze constitution from a feminist point of view. Now, before we commence and we delve into the two questions that were a part of this initial reading circle, uh, I would like to discuss with you and explore the meaning of constitution and what actually lies at the core of this concept called constitution that has become so intrinsic to modern polity. Now, according to me, there are two central features of a constitution. And when I say constitution, I don't imply constitution as a text. Rather, what I imply is that constitution as an idea. Now, what would possibly be these two central features of the Constitution? Now, the first important feature of a Constitution is that Constitution acts as a limitation on the power. Now, now the manner in which I describe power is, many people will say that constitution is a limitation on arbitrary exercise of power. No, constitution is a limitation on power itself, not on misuse of power, not on arbitrary exercise of power, but power plain and simple. And the power is not the power of the state. Rather, what I feel is that it's very naive to argue that constitution limits the power only of the state, because in a manner, this would be based on an assumption that the power of the sovereign is the only form of power worthy of our consideration. But this is something that Foucault, in his writings, has explored and has said that power is very cunning because it can change in response to our efforts to free ourselves from its grip. So power can manifest in several forms, and it is not necessary that the power that we are talking about is the power only of the state. Now, why does this explanation on the fact that power is not the sovereign power becomes important? Because it is very much a part of how we understand part 3 of the constitution. So if we start from the very first article of part 3, that is article 12 of the constitution, the entire edifice of part 3, which can be found in article 12 of the constitution, is premised on this public private dichotomy. So apart from few articles like article 15 clause 2, article 17, article 23, and to an extent article 24, 21, which can be considered as providing sort of guarantee against fundamental right violations from private entities, the entire edifice of part 3 of the constitution is premised on protecting individuals from arbitrary exercise of power by the public. And what is the public is defined by article 12 of the constitution. So a lot of our understanding of part 3 and fundamental rights in part 3, rather the entire jurisprudence on human rights, is has traditionally been based on this state versus individual understanding of human rights. And the state versus individual relation is something that we call vertical application of human rights. So this public-private dichotomy becomes essentially important, and that's why it becomes very important to understand that what is it that Constitution wants to limit, and essentially what is it that Part 3 of the Constitution wants to limit? Does it want to limit the exercise of power by the public, or does it also want to limit the exercise of the power of the private? Because challenging this public-private dichotomy is very essential in a feminist debate. And when we talk about engendering Article 25 of the Constitution vis-a-vis the women, it becomes very important to understand that whether this public-private dichotomy is something that prevents the assertion of rights by women within the fold of Part 3 of the Constitution, and do we need to challenge this public-private dichotomy in order to move beyond the structural inequalities and discrimination and violence suffered by the women? So my first premise that I'm laying open before you, and obviously I would invite comments and questions on this part, is that at least the manner in which I understand constitution is a limitation on power. Now, the second very essential an idea which is very intrinsic to the idea of constitution, and again emphasizing on the fact I'm not talking about the text of the constitution, but rather constitution as an idea, is that constitution is aspirational. So constitution is not supposed to reflect the practical social realities or mold itself in accordance to the social realities, the social violence, discrimination, and marginalization that occurs. Now, this does not, of course, mean that those realities do not impact the constitution making process. The task before the people is to use the constitution to elevate those realities to match the constitutional aspirations, and not compromise with the aspirations so that it may echo the social conditions. So in that aspect, constitution is charged with resisting the culture of domination and of ensuring that the aspirations of the marginalized, the dominated, are translated into tangible reality. And if they're not translated, at least it is the duty of the constitution, or it lies at the foundation of the idea of constitution, that it must at least provide legitimacy to their aspirations, even if it fails to translate them into tangible reality. It must at least ensure that it provides legitimacy to their aspirations. Now, this charge of unpragmatism of constitutional interpretation, that constitutional interpretation is unpragmatic. Now, these are the charges that we have seen in several judgments cropping up. So, for example, uh, we see Suresh Kaushal judgment, wherein one of the arguments given by the judgment for not reading down Section 377 was that the claim did not come the claim per se on Section 377 does not affects a very minuscule minority, and therefore the discrimination is something that must not be is not something that needs to be considered by the judiciary. A similar charge or an argument being made both in the review petition of Indian Young Lawyer Association and also in the dissenting opinion of Justice Indu Malhotra, when what was being argued that the individuals who have approached the court are not followers of that specific religion or belief, and that's why the constitution need not or the judiciary need not intervene into matters of religion, religious belief and faith. Now, so it is generally that the idea that this charge of unpragmatism of constitutional interpretation, what it does, it many times forces us to concede grounds. And when we concede grounds, what we do is we fail the aspirations of those who are making unpopular social claims. Now, this is a trap that we keep falling into. We keep just trying to justify the practical worth of the Constitution and justify that Constitution echoes the social reality instead of trying to project Constitution as an aspirational value, something that social realities must try to match to. Now, justifying that Constitution and social realities do mirror each other is therefore a trap that needs to be avoided at all cost. Uh, and constitutional interpretation need not take up the task of ensuring that constitutional aspirations always coincide with social reality. The gap will always exist. The aim is to bridge the gap. And therefore, so what the idea of constitution must also carry this critique of unpragmatism with pride and claim and reclaim and reproduce these aspirations. So, this is how I would like to introduce this idea of constitution. That the idea of constitution is first that it is a limitation on power and power found anywhere, whether found in the public or whether found in the private. And the second being that constitution is aspirational. Uh, Now, having said so, let us come to the two questions, the two main questions around which today's discussion would revolve. And those two questions are very simple questions and yet complicated. That is one, uh, whether the essential religious practice test is in conformity with Article 25 of the Constitution. Uh, and the second, whether personal law is a law under Article 13, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Now, what we will see is that the answer and response to these two questions have to a very large extent, and the judicial response to these questions rather, have to a very large extent helped us or influenced the interpretation of women's rights within specifically the context of religion. That how those do these three ideas intersect and interlink with each other: the idea of constitution, the idea of right to equality of women and the right of autonomy of women, right to dignity of women, and the idea of right to religion, which is again a part of fundamental rights. So how do these three different and overlapping ideas coincide with each other in our constitutional journey? Is Indian Constitution's journey is something that can be understood by analyzing the response to these two questions. One being whether personal law is law under Article 13, Clause 1, and whether the essential religious practice test is in conformity with Article 25 of the Constitution. So now the manner in which I understand the task which Anas has given to me is to pose the questions before you. And as I believe it's going to be an interactive session, so you are free to raise hand, bring your comments, queries, and respond, and even intervene in the discussion to clarify what is being said. So, please feel free to intervene in between if you feel so. So what I was saying was that the manner in which the manner in which we are going to proceed is that we are going to analyze this legal provision from 2 points of view: textual and contextual. Now, though as students of law, we are taught, and the methodology that we are taught in the class is generally the textual methodologies, where we try to limit ourselves to the text of the provisions and the text of the legal provisions. But what is very essentially important is also to provide the context to those analysis, and the context to those constitutional interpretation and legal interpretations that we come with. So as a first step, let's concentrate on the text of the Constitution, both in case of Article 13 and Article 25 of the Constitution. And let's pick up the first question, that is whether personal law is law under Article 13, Clause 1 of the Constitution. Now, this is something that has been a matter of discussion for a very long period of time. And it started with a very interesting case, a Bombay High Court decision called State of Bombay versus Narasu Appamali, which was in response to a claim challenging the validity of Bombay Prevention of Hindu Bigamous Marriage Act 1946. And it's a 1951 judgment coming close and heels with the Constitution coming into force. Now, an extremely interesting analysis of Article 13, Clause 1. And if we have a look at the Constitution, what we will find is that Article 13 defines what a law is. Now, the definition of law under Article 13 does not include the term personal laws. So one of the questions, so for example, if you look at Article 13(3) Clause A, what you will find is that unless the context otherwise requires, law includes ordinance, order, bylaw, rule, regulation, notification, custom, or usage having in the territory of India the force of law. Now, and 13 Clause 3 Clause B defines laws in force. Now, both these clauses, 13(3)A and 13(3)B, do not include within its fold something called personal law. That though it is an inclusive definition, so an inclusive definition generally would mean that it can include something apart from what has been mentioned under these under 13(3)A and 13(3)B. But there is an omission of personal laws under both 13(3)A and 13(3)B. So now what we need to understand is that how this entire relationship of personal laws vis-a-vis Part 3 of the Constitution emerged. It emerged with this extremely famous judgment, Bombay High Court judgment of State of Bombay versus Narasu Appamali, wherein what the court held was that the term law under Article 13, Clause 3 does not include personal laws. The reason being that if the Constituent Assembly would have wanted to include the term personal law, it would have done it expressly. The omission or the absence of personal law from Article 13, Clause 3 itself implies that the intention of the Constituent Assembly was not to make personal law a subject matter of Part 3 of the Constitution. And because it was not a subject matter of Part 3 of the Constitution, therefore, what happens is that you cannot challenge it. You cannot challenge those personal laws for violating Part 3 of the Constitution. So, because Article 12 and Article 13 are like gatekeepers to Part 3 of the Constitution, wherein Article in order to prove that there is a violation of fundamental right, you either have to prove that the violating entity is a state, or you have to prove that the laws in questions are laws, that the laws in questions are laws within the fold of Article 13 of the Constitution. Now, by excluding personal laws from Article 13 of the Constitution, what the judiciary did in Narasu Appamali was that it removed a very big chunk of laws which were applied from being challenged on the ground of violating Article 13. And this is something which has been reiterated and reinforced time and again right until 2020. Now, the biggest example of how the judiciary has reinforced and kept out personal laws from the ambit of Article 13 can be seen in Shaira Bano judgment, wherein, and Shaira Bano judgment is an extremely interesting judgment, which every law student must read, because while there is a concurrence on the decision, the ratio, there is no concurrence on the ratio which has been invoked to arrive at the decision. So you find the minority opinion delivered by Justice Keher focusing excessively on the idea that personal laws is not a law under Article 13 of the Constitution. And because personal law is not a law under Article 13 of the Constitution, they cannot be challenged for violating fundamental rights. Similarly, you find other majority opinions focusing on the question of or using different methodologies or different ratios and reason to arrive at a conclusion as to whether triple talaq is constitutional or not in Shaira Bano. So, for example, one of the opinions says that triple talaq is something which is not recognized in the Sharia and is not recognized by the Quran, and therefore, because it is not a part of the personal laws and it is not a part of the Quran, that's why we don't even. It is something which is not recognized by the personal laws. That's why it is unconstitutional. But none of the judgments nowhere did they delve into the question of whether personal laws are laws under Article 13. And that's why many times Shaira Bano is considered to be a missed opportunity. A missed opportunity because just by arguing and saying that personal laws are laws under Article 13, a lot of the issues that arise with regard to applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution to personal laws and right to religion, because personal laws are intrinsically linked with right to religion, could have been resolved. And this would have given an avenue to the movement of women to challenge the structural violence and discrimination that is perpetuated in the name of religion against women. They could have used this avenue to challenge the secondary position that is accorded in almost all the religions across the world to women. So this golden opportunity was lost in Shaira Banu judgment. Now the only ray of hope, a very silver lining, which we can see, is in Justice Nariman's opinion. So Justice Nariman's opinion did not use it as a ratio to come to the conclusion that triple talaq is unconstitutional. However, what Justice Nariman definitely did was that Justice Nariman led open this question that we need to revisit perhaps this idea that personal law is not a law under Article 13 of the Constitution. But if you have gone through Shaira Banu judgment, which I'm sure all of you must have gone through, you would realize that Justice Nariman rather said that Shariat Application Act is a codification, and because it is a codification, it is a state action, and every state action is subject to the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution, and that is how he made Shariat Application Act amenable to a challenge premised on Article 14 of the Constitution. So, but even then, he didn't take the route of arguing that personal laws are laws under Article 13 of the Constitution. Rather, he took the legislative route, arguing that because a Shariat Application Act is a piece of legislation which has codified the law, and this act of codification is a state action. Therefore, it is amenable to Part 3 of the Constitution. However, there is a small paragraph in Shaira Bano judgment wherein this question at least is laid open, that perhaps there is a need to revisit this ghost of Narsu, and that is how Justice Chandrachud calls it in Indian Young Lawyer Association case, that we need to revisit this ghost of Narsu and maybe in some future decision argue and understand whether personal laws can be law under Part 3 of the Constitution. Now, what is the benefit, at least how can this small change in the interpretation of understanding personal laws as laws under Article 13 of the Constitution change this entire dimension of women's right, especially vis-a-vis religion? Now, this can happen because then almost all personal laws would be subject and can be questioned for violating Part 3 of the Constitution. And this is very much, and this understanding is very much in sync with the manner in which Article 25 is also drafted. Now we will come to that later, as at how the text of the Article 25 is somehow there appears to be a divergence between how the Article 25 has been drafted and how Article 25 has been interpreted.
नहीं आप लिंक क्लिक करिए दिखाइए.
So what we find is that that Article 13 of the Constitution, by refusing to acknowledge personal laws as laws under Part 3 of the Constitution, does sort of close a lot of options which are open to women challenging the discriminatory practices of religion. Now, having said so, and having at least sort of covered the text of Article 13, let's come to the text of Article 25 of the Constitution. Now, and this is a very interesting development which has happened over a period of time. A doctrine which has been made a part of Article 25 of the Constitution, a judicial doctrine, and there are both sorts of claim made whether this doctrine should essentially be a part of Article 25 or not be a part of 25. And for that, I would like all of you to very minutely observe the text of both Article 25 and Article 25 and Article 26 of the Constitution. Now, so what Article 25 says, and let us just look at Article 25 Clause 1 in isolation. Okay. Now, if we look at Article 25 Clause 1, just as in a plain simple reading, it says two important things, so the four important things. And it is the only provision in the entire Part 3 of the Constitution that starts with a subject to clause. That starts with subject to. None of the other provisions in Part 3 of the Constitution start with subject to. But Article 25 starts with a subject to. And that is the beauty of Article 25. And we need to analyze and understand why did the Constituent Assembly, why did the Constitution framers try to insert the subject to clause under Article 25 of the Constitution? So what it says is subject to public order, morality, and health, and other provisions of Part 3 of the Constitution. So Part 3 is not just subject to, Article 25 is not just subject to public order, morality, and health. It is also subject to other provisions of Part 3 of the Constitution. All persons are equally entitled to freedom of conscience and the right freely to profess, practice, and propagate religion. So there are two important points that we need to understand through a reading of Article 25 of the Constitution. One is obviously that Article 25 has been, apart from being the limitations on Article 25 operating in the form of public order, morality, and health, the limitation on Article 25 also operates in the form of Part 3 of the Constitution. So the text of Article 25 seems to imply that Article 25 becomes subordinate to Part 3 of the Constitution. Part 3 rights are going to ensure or determine how the right to religion within the fold of Article 25 operates. Now, Article 25 Clause 2 says that nothing in this article shall affect the operation of any existing law or prevent the state from making any law, regulating or restricting any economic, financial, political, or other secular activity which may be associated with religious practice. Now, what Article 25 2A seeks to do is it tries to bring about a disjunction, tries to distinguish between secular practices and religious practices. Okay. So it says that economic, financial, political, or other secular activities are subject to regulation and restriction by the state, but religious activities are not subject to regulation and restriction by state. Now, but again, we need to read Article 25 Clause 2A not in isolation, but also along with Article 25 2B. Now, what 25 2B says is that providing for social welfare and reform or the throwing open of Hindu religious institutions of a public character to all classes and sections of Hindus. So the state will not be prevented from implementing social reform, social welfare and reform, or throwing open Hindu religious institutions of a public character to all classes and sections of Hindus. And there doesn't seem to be a distinction being made under Article 25 2B vis-a-vis religious activities and secular activities. So while 25 2A sort of makes a distinction, tries to distinguish between religious practices and secular practices, 25 2B does not provide that disclaimer or an exception in the form of state not interfering with certain kinds of religious practices or beliefs, provided that the reform or the act of the state is in pursuance of social welfare and reform. Now this becomes extremely important. Uh, uh, so, uh, and this brings us to the second question, something that Sarthak is also asking, that since Article 26 doesn't include subject to other provision, does that mean 26 stands at an equal footing of Article 14 and 21? Now, it's a very interesting question, and this is something which the courts have answered in very clear terms. And so, and before I answer your question, Sarthak, let us just go through a brief reading of Article 26 of the Constitution. Now, Article 26 of the Constitution says, subject to public order, morality, and health, every religious denomination or any section thereof shall have the right A, B, C, and D. Now, obviously, so Sarthak's observation is very relevant to the extent that uh, it does it those like Article 26 said subject to public order, morality, and health. It does not mention subject to other provisions of Part 3 of the Constitution. So the text of Article 26, unlike the text of Article 25, seems to say that while Article 25 is subject to Part 3 of the Constitution, Article 26 is not subject to Part 3 of the Constitution. Okay. Now, uh, this is the textual reading of both Article 25 and Article 26 of the Constitution. Now, let us go further and understand that understand how Article 25 and 26 have been understood by the judiciary. Now, and let's start with Article 25, Clause 1 and 25, Clause 2. Now, 25, Clause 1 and 25, Clause 2, in the Shirur Mutt case, okay, a very interesting doctrine was brought into picture. And that doctrine being the doctrine of essential religious practice. Now, what this essential religious practice does is that what it seeks to argue, and the manner in which essential religious practice text has unfolded over years is that what it seeks to argue is that while all other practices, okay, now before we enter into this question, just a clarification with regard to how the courts have understood religious practices. Now, there is no per se a difference. Religious beliefs and religious beliefs are often manifested in the form of practices. So I don't think it would be proper to argue that religious practice and beliefs can be segregated, because many times it is the practices which are manifested, the beliefs are manifested in the form of practices. Now, having said so, let us understand what Shirur Mutt judgment does. Now, Shirur Mutt judgment, and we are still confining ourselves with the text of both 25 and 26. Shirur Mutt judgment makes a distinction between secular and religious practices. And that distinction is very much apparent under Article 25 2A of the Constitution. Because Article 25 2A does make a distinction between secular practices and religious practices. And that distinction is very apparent in the text of Article 25 2A. But the manner in which this distinction between secular and religious practices has unfolded over years is that this distinction between secular and religious practice now guides the entire interpretation of right to religion. So this distinction now, of which is something which was a part of Article 25 2A, not just guides our understanding of Article 25 2A, but is also included within the realm of Article 25 2B, also within the realm of Article 25 Clause 1. And that is how essential religious practice manifests itself, that essential religious practice is something that will be completely immune from the challenge of or something. And as soon as you say that something is an essential religious practice, the judiciary will not interfere in that essential religious practice. So as soon as you call something an ERP, which is essential religious practice, judiciary is going to refrain from interfering into essential religious practice. So, and it is not just in the context of Article 25 2A, it will also be in the context of Article 25 1, Article 25 2B. So, and as soon as you say something is an essential religious practice, the judiciary will refrain. That's why a large part of the arguments, if you look both in the Shaira Bano judgment and the Indian Young Lawyer Association question judgment, are premised on the fact that in Shaira Bano judgment, triple talaq is an essential religious practice. And in Indian Young Lawyer Association case, a denial of entry to women between the age of 10 and 50 in the Sabrimala temple is something which is an essential religious practice of the Ayyappans. Now, So the entire argument is based on the claim, and the argument revolved around the idea that something which is an essential religious practice will not be intervened or interfered with by the judiciary and will not be subject to the limitations prescribed by the constitution. So, and it's a very interesting development which has happened, that something which was a distinction, at least under the text, only under Article 25(2)(a) of the Constitution, converts itself into an all-permeating principle that guides not just Article 25(2)(a) of the Constitution, but also Article 25(1) and Article 25(2)(b) of the Constitution. Now, having said so, let us come to how judiciary has interpreted it. So, the essential religious practice test has been legitimized and re-emphasized by judiciary over a period of time. But I would like to briefly deviate from our discussion and perhaps answer Sarthak's question, because that will also be relevant in the course of our discussion. Sarthak's question being that does the absence of other provisions of Part 3 of the Constitution under Article 26 imply that it is not subject to other Part 3 of the Constitution? Now, the manner in which we understand Part 3 of the Constitution, and this is how the interpretation has successively evolved and emerged, is that we don't look at any provision of the Constitution in isolation. There was a time when we did look at Part 3 provisions in isolation, in A.K. Gopalan judgment. But post-emergency, rather during the period pre-period and post-emergency period, we saw a lot of shift in the manner in which Part 3 of the Constitution started being interpreted. So instead of looking at Part 3 and each provision of the Constitution as an isolated island or a watertight compartment, what we started started understanding Part 3 of the Constitution as a fluid Part 3, wherein each and every provision guides the interpretation of the other provision. And now this is very relevant in the context of how the entire Article 14 debate has emerged, and how this entire jurisprudence of anti-discrimination law has emerged, wherein what we argue is that Article 15, 16, 17 are nothing but a reiteration of the principles of Article 14. So even if Article 14 was not there, the manner in which even if Articles 15, 16, and 17 were not there in the Constitution, the operation of the Constitution would have been in consonance with the spirit of Article 15, 16, and 17, because Article 14 becomes an umbrella provision which guides the interpretation of 15, 16, and 17. Now, a similar interpretation has been given by the court, wherein it tries to sort of harmoniously reconcile the apparent textual conflict between Article 25 and 26 of the Constitution, and the manner in which the courts have understood or interpreted Article 25 and 26 is that both Article 25(2)(a) and Article 26(b) is regulated by Article 25(2)(b). Okay, so both Article 25(2)(a) and 26(b) is regulated by and 26 is regulated by Article 25(2)(b). Apart from that, having said so, another argument and which is in line with this idea of harmoniously construing and this and of upholding this interlink between different constitutional provisions under Part 3 and not understanding them in isolation is that Article 25 Clause 1 is the clause that guides the interpretation of right to religion in the subsequent clauses. So the umbrella provision being Article 25 Clause 1, wherein the core of right to religion is to be found under Article 25 Clause 1. And the subsequent provisions have to be understood and interpreted in the context of Article 25 Clause 1, not in isolation with Article 25 Clause 1. So what can be argued? Obviously, we can argue otherwise as well, and this is the beauty of law, that there are several interpretations possible, and that's why law is not determinate. There is a sort of indeterminacy to law, and it is this indeterminacy which can be used as a source of emancipation by the marginalized community. So, but but what you can argue, and there is always a scope for arguing that Article 25 Clause 1 would guide the interpretation of both Article 25 Clause 2 as well as Article 26 of the Constitution. So now, and this becomes extremely relevant in how we understand and contextualize the text of Article 25 and Article 26 vis-a-vis this test of essential religious practice. So now, as I was saying that essential religious practice test was introduced in Shirur Mat case, with this introduced in Shirur Mat case, and what happened subsequent to Shirur Mat case was that this distinction, which was just a distinction which was in the text, a part of Article 25 2A, was subsequently sort of made an overarching principles which guides our entire understanding of right to religion in Article 25, right to religion in Part 3 of the Constitution. So now, having said so, where do we locate this essential religious practice? Now, in a series of judgments that we have gone through, that have unfolded subsequent to Shirur Mat judgment, what we see is that essential religious practice test has been invoked time and again by the courts in order to sort of immunize a certain part of religion from the application and the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution. So there are two manners in which your religious codes of conduct and religious laws and religious practices and beliefs are immunized from the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution. One is by not reading personal law as a part of Part 3 of Article 13 of the Constitution. What you do is you immunize this entire gamut of personal laws from the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution. And the second is by considering something which is essential to the religion to be completely immune from judicial interference, and that's why and therefore from the scope and applicability of Article 25 and 26 of the Article 25 of the Constitution. And that is the second way in which you immunize this sphere of right to religion. So what started as a right which is subject to Part 3 of the Constitution sort of gets translated into a right which operates as a parallel institutional structure, right at par, if not supreme to the Constitution, at least at par with the Constitution, such that constitutional interpretations are not supposed to intervene in the rights, in those specific right to religion being enjoyed by a community, specifically if those rights are essential religious practices, and the aspirations of the constitutions will not be implemented when it comes to essential religious practice, when it comes to personal laws, irrespective of the structural discrimination and the structural lack of autonomy that it creates for several marginalized within the fold of religion itself. So that is the problem with essential religious practice says that instead of though right to religion was made subject to Part 3 of the Constitution, what essential religious practice tries to do is that it elevates the essential religious practices of a specific religion to a status wherein even the constitutional doctrines and provisions cannot intervene. So Part 3 becomes completely inapplicable to those essential religious practice. Part 3 becomes completely inapplicable to Part 3 of the Constitution. Personal laws are something which cannot be challenged under Article 13, Clause 1 of the Constitution for violating fundamental rights. Now, so the interesting point is that almost all the decisions, including the two decisions that was the topic of our discussion, that are the topic of our discussion today, that is Shaira Bano judgment and Indian Young Lawyer Association case. Both of them rely on essential religious practice to disprove the claim of both disprove the claims that triple talaq is not a part of Muslim law, and to disprove the claim that disallowing entry to women within the age of 10 and 50 is something which is not a part of essential religious practice. And by saying that it is not is a part of essential religious practice, what they have done is they have themselves legitimized the essential religious practice test. So, despite the fact that there seems to be an inherent problem and contradiction with essential religious practice, if you try to sort of understand ERP doctrine vis-a-vis the text of the Constitution, and also with vis-a-vis the context of the idea of Constitution, as we discussed. The problem is that essential religious practice test has been legitimized again and again by the judiciary, both in the arguments, not by, and also by the lawyers in the manner in which they invoke essential religious practice to lay the claim that whether the specific practice must be immunized from judicial interference or intervention by Part 3 of the Constitution. So, what so what does essential religious practice test try to indicate when we are trying to understand the position of women that we talked about within the fold of religion? Now, and it is something that is that I find extremely relevant whenever it comes to any question with regard to a feminist reading of the Constitution, or rather any question with regard to feminism. And this is a quote from Simone de Beauvoir, wherein she cites and she lays her finger on the exact problem of why women rights are unable to translate into legitimate social claims. Why women rights are always made subservient to other forms of social claims. Why is it that the assertion of right to equality by women finds itself in the last, as a last, is in hierarchically it is placed in the last as compared to other claims of structural discrimination and violence. Now, what she says is extremely relevant to our discussions even today. And I will just try to read out the specific lines because I don't want to change the language because it will take away the essence out of it. And what she says is that the reason for this is that women lack concrete means for organizing themselves into a unit, which can stand face to face with the correlative unit. They have no past, no history, no religion of their own, and they have no such solidarity of work and interest as that of other disadvantaged groups. Meaning thereby that it is very difficult to organize women into one collective whole, because, for example, a white woman would always recognize herself with white male as compared to a black woman. A Dalit woman would maybe recognize herself more with a Dalit man as compared to a Brahmin woman. So, so there is a problem, an intrinsic problem with women organizing themselves as a collective whole, and this actually creates a lot of problem in all the claims that women try to assert in all the folds of social realities, including constitutional matters, when they try to assert their right. Now, and this is what exactly that the doctrines of law, like personal law not being a law under Part 3 of the Constitution, women, essential religious practice tries to exploit this weakness of the women assertion of rights to organize themselves into a cohesive group. Because women in many of these judgments you will go through Narzu Appamali, go through Shaira Bano judgment, go through Indian Young Lawyer Association, and also go through the different comments that have come and the arguments that have been made by both the petitioners and the respondent. They fail to recognize women as a class. What they say is that we are not making any discrimination on the basis of class. There is no class-based discrimination, because women have not even been recognized as a class in itself. And this is something which is reflected in the judgments and the arguments which have been given in the several judgments, and also the critiques that have happened outside the courtroom. That women are not a class in themselves. So there is per se no discrimination. It is open for everyone except women, and that too women of limited age group, 10 to 50. And women therefore are not a class in itself. Those 10 to 50, the women between 10 to 50 years cannot be a class in themselves, and they cannot be there cannot be any discrimination only on the basis of class. Now, this is a very interesting application of what Simone de Beauvoir way back understood as an inherent weakness of women's movement, the inability of the women's movement to organize themselves into a collective. And this inability of the women's movement to organize itself into a collective is often exploited by giving a patriarchal reading to the constitutional provisions. And it is this inherent weakness which according to me gets also reflected in how we understand our personal laws within Article 13 of the Constitution and how we understand essential religious practice test. Okay, I think there are a lot of questions, so maybe I would like to pick up few questions in between so that it does not just become a sort of monologue. Just give me 1 second. Okay, there is a question. If there is a clash between personal law and law of the land, what has to be done? As what I can understand from Shaira Banu case, it was not just a matter of personal law, but women's rights. Yes, so this is a question by Aditya Raj. Aditya, that is the inherent problem with not reading personal laws as laws between as a part of Article 13 of the Constitution. There is nothing that you can do. If something is considered as personal law, Part 3 becomes completely inapplicable. If something is considered as an essential religious practice, Part 3 becomes completely inapplicable. So what we basically imply to say that if something is a personal law, irrespective of the structural of the discrimination and the violence it perpetuates against the women, that will be given legitimacy by the Constitution. The Constitution will legitimize discrimination, structural discrimination and violence against women if that structural discrimination and violence can be proven to be a part of personal law and it can proven to be a part of essential religious practice. So what happens therefore is that as soon as you identify something as an ERP or identify something as a personal law, there is not much you can do through by way of Part 3 of the Constitution. Part 3 becomes redundant for a woman asserting her right by arguing that her personal law is discriminatory or a practice which is an essential religious practice is discriminatory. So there is not much that can be done. And that is the inherent problem with not recognizing personal law as Part 3 of the Constitution, because then it leaves a large domain of religious of religion, which is completely immune from the application of Part 3 of the Constitution. Now, one of the reasons which is generally advanced in order to not subject and not make personal laws a part of Part 3 and to argue in favor of essential religious practices, that if we implement Part 3 of the Constitution on all matters of religion, including essential religious practice, we would be basically negating the right to religion, because then Constitution will determine what is legitimate and what is not legitimate in a religion. Now, there is there is a logic to this argument, but the question is very simple. As constitutional adjudicators of constitutional dispute, adjudicators of constitutional right, what is the responsibility of the judiciary? The responsibility of the judiciary is not to sit as theologians, trying to interpret what right to religion is, what is a religion. The obligation that has been cast on the judiciary is very singular in nature, to apply the principles of the Constitution, not to apply the principles of religion. Now, an argument can definitely be made, and this is a very valid argument, that if judiciary that the reason why judiciary sits and decides what is an essential religious practice test is so that it does not negate the very idea of religion. But again, as I said, it is not the task which has been given to the judiciary to understand what is and what is not a religion. And this again goes back to the two ideas of constitution that we discussed initially, that whether constitution, what is the idea of constitution? The idea of constitution is to act as an aspiration and to legitimize social claims, howsoever unpopular it is, howsoever marginalized it is, howsoever against the idea of religion it is. And not worry about whether, and not particularly worry about whether it will or it will not translate into reality, because translation of constitutional principles or constitutional aspiration into realities would take a long amount of time. But the start begins from legitimizing at least those unpopular social claims if they are in the spirit of the Constitution, and not denouncing them just because it is not practical to to legitimize them. Just because it has not been accepted by the social reality, we don't need to denounce constitutional aspiration because of the impracticability of its implementation. And this leads to at the cost of sort of extending this the response to this answer, this leads me to another very interesting aspect of legal theory. So in legal theory specifically, and in legal theory, I'm invoking two positivists, HLA Hart and Kelsen. Both of them argue, and what they argue is that uh, the effectiveness of the law does not in any manner determine the efficacy of the law. Sorry, the efficacy of the law in no manner determines the legitimacy of the law. So whether the law can be translated or not, how effective it is the implementation of the law, will not lead us to challenge the legitimacy of the law. And the most easiest example that I can give to you is of Dowry Prohibition Act. Now, you will not challenge, or you will not, no one will call Dowry Prohibition Act to be unconstitutional because Dowry Prohibition Act is almost never implemented. So the effectiveness of the law or the implementation of the law is never a ground for determining the legitimacy of the law. So why does it suddenly become important to ensure that constitutional aspirations are first implemented in the society before they are legitimized by the Constitution? When we do not look into the effectiveness, or we do not bother to look into whether a law is being implemented or not, because if we did go into the implementation part of the law and use implementation as a premise on which you adjudicate the constitutional validity or the legitimacy or law or not, there will be no law left, because almost all the laws are implemented in a faulty manner. But the implementation is never something which we consider while determining the legitimacy of laws. Then why is the sudden urge to sort of first argue that the constitutional aspirations must first be accepted by the social realities and must become popular claims before they find their exception in legitimate legal claims? Why not legitimize unpopular social claims and allow the law to take its recourse and legitimize those unpopular social claims and translate them into popular social realities? Why this sort of discrepancy in the manner when we talk about the rights of the marginalized, specifically the rights of the women within the fold of Part 3 of the Constitution, when we do not use the same logic and methodology and pedagogy to determine the legitimacy of law vis-a-vis other subject matters? So I know it's a very large response, but I hope that sort of answered what you were trying to ask. If not, maybe you can come up with a comment. Now, there is another question by Bharat Chaudhary, that is there any relevance of courts determining practices to be essential or not essential when religious practice are by nature irrational? For example, Jallikattu was determined to be not essential by the court, but amendment legislations overturned the effect of the court judgment, and the practice is unfortunately still followed. Do you agree that the constitutional morality used in the Sabrimala judgment is an appropriate tool to determine essentiality of religious practice? Okay, Bharat. My argument is, while I understand where you are coming from, and I don't disagree with what you are saying, that constitutional morality must be the pedestal on the basis of which we determine the essentiality of religious practice, what I'm arguing is completely different. What I argue is that there is no need for an essential religious practice test. The task of the judiciary as adjudicators of constitution is not to go into the essentiality of a religious practice, because they are not theologians. The epistemology that they are talking about, the methodology, is not a methodology which is resorted to by religion. The methodology and the principles that they are applying are constitutional principles. They are not tasked with the obligation to apply religious principle in order to determine what the law is. Rather, they have to, and the task before them is extremely simple: to determine the legitimacy of an act or an omission on the basis of constitutional principles, not on the basis of religious principles. So we don't even need to go into the question of essentiality of religious practice. It is not something that that constitution should be bothered with, whether practice is essential or not to a specific religion. When there is a contestation of a right within the fold of Article 25 of the Constitution, the task before the judiciary is very simple: to to determine whether that specific religious practice or belief meets, can in any manner, is in conformity with the idea of the Constitution, and can it in some manner be reconciled with the idea of the Constitution. If there is if both of them are at extreme ends of the pole and there is absolutely no way of reconciling them, then the court will have to allow for constitutional aspirations and value to trump over religious rights. That is the only manner and the only task that is there before the judiciary. The task is not to go into the essentiality of religious practice. So I agree with your comment to the extent that yes, constitutional morality, when it comes to adjudicating constitutional issues, the only morality that we are talking about is constitutional morality. But what I'm arguing is, and I would not like to agree with the second part of your question. And what I would argue is that we don't even need to go into the question of essential religious practice, both because of the text and because of the context. The text of Article 21 being extremely clear, subject to other provisions of Part 3. And the most interesting part of the subject to other provisions of Part 3 is that there has hardly been any analysis, maybe before Justice Chandrachud's opinion, or a detailed analysis, very less detailed analysis on this subject to other provisions of Part 3 of the Constitution when it comes to right to religion. Except in Justice Chandrachud's opinion in Indian Young Lawyer Association case, you will find a discussion on how Article 25 is subject to other provisions of Part 3. But in most of the judgments, including the other concurring opinions, majority opinion in Indian Young Lawyer Association case itself, you don't find the invocation of subject to other provisions of Part 3 to validate or invalidate the issues in question. So, so the answer is always via the medium of whether it is a part of essential religious practice or not, whether it is a part of public, whether it is in any manner violating public order, morality, or health or not. But the simple provision of subject to other provisions of Part 3 has hardly been invoked to sort of analyze and legitimize or delegitimize a specific religious practice and belief. So that's it. My answer to Bharat very precisely would be yes, constitutional morality can be the only morality that we are talking about when it comes to applying constitutional principle. And the task of judiciary is extremely simple, though it has been complicated to a very large extent. But it is extremely simple that the task it has been given is to apply constitutional principles, even when it comes to entertaining religious issues. Because judiciary is not the judiciary is not a theologian. It is not given the task of ascertaining what is and what is not an essential religious practice, and that is something which the judiciary has very correctly recognized. That task of ascertaining what is and what is not religious must be given to the religious community itself. It is not the task of the judiciary. What the task of the judiciary, however, is to apply constitutional principle, even if it comes at the cost of delegitimizing certain religious practices and belief. Because as I understand it, women have often argued, and it is a very important argument in the feminist debate, that while law tries to absolve or remove the discriminations in the public, it hardly does anything to remove the discrimination in the private. And by maintaining that public-private divide, it reinforces the gender inequalities. Now, for example, and there are several aspects where this gender inequality is reinforced, because law will not interfere in your private sphere, and because law does not interfere in the private sphere, only in the public sphere, a lot of the discriminations begin in the private, and that is why the famous debate, the personal is the political. It is the private that is the root of all the structural discriminations that are perpetuated against women. They are only manifested in the public. So we don't need to move from the public to the private. What we need to do is we need to remove the discriminations from the private in order to ensure that the public is free from those structural discrimination. Now, what these tests reinforce and what this idea of essential religious practices reinforce that because essential religious practice is the private sphere of a religious community, the constitution is not bothered with applying the principles of constitution in that private sphere. What it is bothered is only when those structural discriminations operate in the fold of public, not in the fold of private. So we are going to apply constitution, and the applicability of the constitution is limited to the public and will not extend into the private. And that itself is a problematic concept, at least if understood from the perspective of women's movement and the assertion of rights of the women, because as I said, most of the discrimination and the inequalities against women are perpetuated in the private and not the public. And that also sort of brings us to another important reduction and the critique of the law itself, that law is limited in scope. We should, and though this is a subject of an extensive debate and discussion, and I'm not going to go into detail, but just wanted to respond to it that that law is not a Pandora's box. Law is not something that is a panacea of all wrongs. There is a limited scope to the law, and most of the time, what you will find is law in itself perpetuates the social inequalities. But there are certain instances where we can definitely use law for the benefit of legitimizing unpopular social claims, and we should definitely use that law, that opportunity to legitimize unpopular social claims. But we also need to understand, and the entire argument and using law to help us towards emancipation must be understood and used with a disclaimer and the rider that law is limited. The role of the law is limited, and we need to find other avenues to fight such prejudices, marginalization, and discrimination, and law being just one of the tools and not being a comprehensive tool. Okay, I think there is several other questions. In light of there is a question by Anmol. Uh, in light of the Supreme Court verdict on Sabrimala, wouldn't the doctrine of non-retrogression be at loggerheads with essential religious practices? Anmol, can you explain what you mean by non-retrogression? And while you explain it, maybe I will stick upon to the next question and then come back to your question. So there is a question by Shivansh Saxena. Keeping in mind the constant tussle between some personal laws and fundamental rights, do you see uniform civil code as a solution to these inequalities? Okay, an extremely interesting question. Now, one of the major reasons why uniform civil code or the claim for uniform civil code is made is order to address gender inequalities. So most of the popular rhetoric on uniform civil code is with the viewpoint of uniform civil code being as the only solution to address gender inequalities in religious and personal laws. So, and not that it is not a logical claim being made, but the same can be addressed, and there is, and I will say that how this rhetoric in itself becomes problematic to an extent. The same solution, the same purpose can be achieved by simply reading personal laws as laws under Article 13. Why not say so? Why not, if the judiciary is not keen on taking the task of answering the question and sort of overcoming the ghost of Narasu, as Justice Chandrachud calls it in Indian Young Bar Association case, of reading personal laws under Article 13, Clause 3 of the Constitution, why not the legislature, the constituent parliament bring about a constitutional amendment inserting personal laws under Article 13, Clause 3? So the answer is very simple. Make personal laws amenable to fundamental right challenge, and almost all the personal laws become and almost all forms of discrimination under Part 3 of the Constitution, or all forms of marginalization and unfreedom perpetuated by personal laws can be overcome by this very simple solution of reading personal laws as laws under Article 13 of the Constitution. And that would also take into consideration the diversity in the practices in India. Uniform civil code would be nothing but a means to implement majoritarian belief systems. And India is a diverse country with hundreds of belief systems. You go to Northeast, you go to South, you go to North, West, Central India, every second village you will find so much diversity in the religious practices and cultures that I don't think a singular law can address that. Uniform civil code cannot be an answer. We don't need to homogenize the diversity in India. Homogenization is not the problem. We need to understand and sort of celebrate the pluralism that India represents, at the same time also understanding that we need to counter the inequalities and the marginalization that occurs within the fold of these pluralistic traditions. And that can very well be done by subjecting, at least vis-a-vis uniform civil code, by subjecting personal laws or subjecting personal laws to part 3 of the Constitution. So I think that would be a better solution. And I don't think uniform civil code would be a solution to these inequalities, because law is essentially male, and you see that almost everywhere. So and this is something that generally comes to my mind. The manner in which rape laws are understood, the manner in which patriarchy is reinforced again and again, how almost every judgment that convicts a rape accused links the rape of the woman with the honor of the woman, therefore legitimizing and reaffirming the patriarchy. So I don't think law per se, just because something can be formulated in legal terms, it becomes equal. It sort of addresses the structural inequalities. That is not the case. Law, most of the time, perpetuate, reinforces, reproduces the inequalities and the discrimination and the marginalization of the society. There are very small windows available to the marginalized to use law for their own, for the benefit of their, for asserting their rights and asserting their claims. And again, as I said, for legitimizing unpopular social claims. Okay. So there is a question, another question from Abu Nasser. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Can it also be argued that ERP makes it politically and socially feasible to decide on practice as any limitation on the practice as any limitation on the grounds of express limitation which may not have public acceptance? Yes, I do think so. And that's why the manner in which essential religious practice test has been evolved by the judiciary is itself very interesting. So, for example, in the Anand Margi case, the two Anand Margi case, wherein the question was very interesting, whether this newly emergent Anand Margi sect, with a Tandav dance and carrying out of Tandav dance and a procession in the public with human skulls and tridents was something which is an essential religious practice or not. And one observation by the court was extremely interesting, and the interesting observation being that when it comes to ancient religion, it is very easy to ascertain what an essential religious practice is. But a newly formed religion, we cannot argue that something is an essential religious, and within a newly formed religion, it becomes difficult to ascertain what an essential religious practice is. And in a manner, what Anand Margi case 1 and 2 did was, it sort of impliedly imposed a condition of antiquity of an essential, of a religious practice in order for it to be an essential. And that would imply that newly emergent religions and religious denomination would not be able to claim something as an essential religious practice, because they will not be able to provide evidence of its antiquity. Okay. Now, this is one of the subtext and the implied logic, the logic that can be implied from how essential religious practice test was used in Anand Margi 1 and 2. And that's why essential, and this is also one of the grounds why ERP doctrine has been criticized, that it gives a way too much power to the judiciary to determine what is and what is not an essential religious practice. And again, as I said, that's not the task of the judiciary to determine the essentiality of a religious practice. The task of the judiciary is to subject the religious practices and beliefs to public order, morality, and health, and other provisions of Part 3. It's very simple, spelled out in the Article 25. So that's why what I feel is, so that's why and I agree with you that it is many times used to maybe to avoid difficult questions, or maybe to ins- maybe to avoid difficult questions or political questions, and it is sometimes also used to sort of immunize certain practices of a religion from most, or rather always used to immunize practices of a religion from the application of part 3 of the constitution. Okay. So there is another question. I think in purview of Article 25, Clause 2, would it be fine to argue that religious institutions should be made open for beggars to sleep at night during winter? By doing so, judiciary is exercising its role of interpreting the Constitution as it is and doing good for such a class of society who have voice for themselves in any manner and aspect. Yeah, but I don't understand, Apesh, that how it would operate within the frame of the two discussions that we are having of essential religious practice uh, and personal laws. But Article 25, Clause 2 says opening of religious institutions in the sense that religious institutions must not discriminate between individuals. But I think many religious institutions are open for people to come and rest and sleep. So I don't think this is some sort of discrimination which religious institutions follow. But yes, uh, that can be, but not. I don't think under the purview of Article 25, Clause 2 of the Constitution. So just correct me if I've not understood your question correctly. Just let me know. Okay. So I think there's some questions sort of which you have answered with regard to essential religious practice. Okay. Okay, this is the question, I think, Anmol. Okay, you are referring to the non-retrogression. So there was a question which was asked whether non-retrogression and ERP are in conflict with each other, which Anmol was asking. So what she's clarifying is the doctrine that was used in Naptek Singh verdict, where they said that social rights require the society and state at large to take step only in progression of a civil and political rights and not in retrogression. Uh, so in the context of Nateh Singh Johar case and the idea of non-retrogression and how the constitutional principles have to be used in a progressive manner. Uh, yes, I agree with you that essential religious practice in sort of impedes the progressive march of the constitution. Uh, and it impedes the materializing of constitutional aspirations, which are supposed to be progressive in nature, and by immunizing a certain sphere completely from the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution, it does somehow contradict with the progression of a constitutional principle. So yes, no, I think I agree with you in that regard. Okay, I think I've answered more or less all the questions, or at least uh, a large chunk of the questions. Anas, in case you find any other question that I have not answered, please let me know. Yeah. Anas, are you there? So, okay. I think I've answered almost all the questions. In case there are any other questions, do let me know. So I would like to conclude merely by, okay, there is one question. Okay, there is a question that triple talaq, and this is by Achal Gupta, triple talaq is also religious practices and other practices and personal laws are also religious in nature. If you could throw some light on it. Yes, so like we were discussing that what is, so right to religion obviously includes right to religious, right to right to indulge in religious practices itself. So belief and religion practice is not something which can be distinguished almost all the time. Rather, most of the time, practice is a manifestation of belief. Now, what the courts have done is that firstly they have held that personal laws are not laws under Article 13 of the Constitution, and by holding so, what they argue is that they are not amenable to Part 3 of the Constitution. And secondly, what they do is that what has been introduced as a doctrine under Article 25 is the doctrine of essential religious practice test, wherein essential religious practice of a specific religion immunizes those practices from the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution. So yes, they are religious in nature. Personal laws are religious in nature. ERP are religious in nature. But the law, as it stands today, sort of argues that both these personal laws and ERP are immune from the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution, and that is how it sort of immunizes a large gamut of large portion of religious personal laws and religious practices from the applicability of Part 3 of the Constitution. And that may often, even if those religious practices and personal laws perpetuate discrimination and violence against the women, those are immunized from the applicability of Part 3. So I hope that answered your question. So because having answered these questions, I think I would just like to briefly conclude by saying it was extremely interesting interacting with all of you, especially the kind of questions that came in. Obviously, both these questions become extremely important in view of the review petition that is pending before the court. And interestingly, a decision being reviewed by a court very close to it being delivered. And this is one of the rare instances in the Supreme Court history. So we need to see how, whether or not, because at least in the framing of the issues by the Supreme Court, it doesn't seem that these are the primary questions that will be addressed, but the understanding and interpretation of both these questions, whether personal law is law or not under Article 13, and whether essential religious practice is something that needs to be legitimized and reinforced by arguing the legitimacy of a religious act on the basis of whether it is a part of ERP or not, is something that would be interesting to observe in the review petition. So maybe the small window that was opened with respect to at least reviewing the Narsu Appa Mali case may be revisited in the review petition, but there doesn't appear to be much of a chance. However, we do not know, but at least in the manner in which Indian Young Lawyer Association case has at least discussed ERP doctrine and the manner in which the issues have been framed in vis-a-vis review petition, there doesn't appear to be a possibility of debunking essential religious practice test. But however, that critique still says that there is a problem, inherent problem with how essential religious practice has evolved over a period of time, and how sort of it stops the march of engendering Part 3 of the Constitution, specifically vis-a-vis Article 25 of the Constitution.
Thank you.
I think.
Thank you, Anumeha. This was very enriching. I don't think there could have been a better discussion than this on this, and it's a very sensitive topic, and it's very difficult for me to be serious around you. But I'm really thankful. I'm hoping that my law student volunteers would be enriched. There are lawyers here, and everyone wanted to hear you once. And we have had a good response on YouTube as well. And so, I mean, I can only thank you for this.
No, thank you. It's all my privilege.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much on behalf of all of us. On behalf of all of us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.